Well, come on in and make yourself comfortable. Tonight we're going to step back into a time before the superstores, back when shopping meant something slower, smaller, and far more personal. Main Street was alive then. You'd hear the bell over the door, smell fresh bread from the bakery, and see the butcher's block lined with brown paper packages. It was neighborly and familiar, but it wasn't always easy. Choices were few, prices could pinch, and if the store was out, you simply went without. I'll share a few stories about how folks managed and what we gained and lost when the big box stores finally rolled in. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, I'd be happy if you gave this video a like or subscribed, but only if it feels right. And do me a favor, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our little constellation light up across the world. Back then, the corner grocery store was more than a place to buy food. It was the heartbeat of a small town, a space where news traveled as quickly as flour was scooped into brown paper sacks. I remember pushing open the screen door and hearing the bell jingle above my head, the kind of sound that said you were known and expected. Shelves weren't endless or towering like they are today. They were tidy rows of essentials: canned vegetables, sacks of sugar, coffee tins stacked 3 high. The grocer often wore a white apron with pencil marks on the pocket, and he knew nearly every family's habits by heart. If Mama picked up a sack of potatoes, he would say, "Need onions with that too?" Sometimes he would slip an apple into the bag for us children, smiling like it was a secret just between us. The store had a lived-in smell, a blend of wooden crates, spices, and sawdust sprinkled on the floor to keep it from being too slick. It wasn't glamorous, but it carried a feeling of belonging, a sense that everything you bought came with a handshake and a nod. Looking back, I realized those small stores stitched the town together more than anyone could have known. Shopping wasn't about filling a cart. It was about seeing neighbors, sharing a word or two, and heading home with enough to last until the next trip. Saturday was the day folks set aside for shopping, and it carried a rhythm that touched every household. In our town, families bundled into cars or walked down the main street, each with a list tucked neatly into a purse or coat pocket. There was no thought of running to the store each evening for one or two things. Instead, Saturday was the time to stock up for the week ahead. Mama would check her list twice, making sure nothing was forgotten because it wasn't so simple to run back later. The streets felt busier on those mornings, with neighbors calling out greetings and children tugging at sleeves, eager for a penny to spend on candy. The stores opened their doors wide, and clerks stood ready with smiles, though the shelves held only what had come in on the delivery truck a few days before. Choices were slimmer, but there was comfort in the routine. Families shopped together, not hurried, often pausing to talk on the sidewalk or share the latest news. By noon, the bags would be full, the car trunks loaded, and most folks would head home for a late lunch. That ritual tied the community together, giving everyone a shared sense of time and place. Saturdays were never just about errands. They were a gathering, a rhythm of life that spoke of order and care, with every purchase measured and purposeful. The butcher shop was one of the most vivid places in town, filled with sounds and scents that have never left my memory. You stepped inside and were greeted by the cool air and the rich smell of fresh cuts laid out behind glass. The butcher himself often wore a striped apron with a cleaver at the ready, his hands quick and practiced as he wrapped meat in brown paper, folding it tight and securing it with twine. There was something steadying about the way he worked. No rush, no prepackaged trays, just a man who knew his trade and knew the families he served. Children were often rewarded with a slice of bologna or a bone for the family dog. Small gestures that carried more warmth than any bargain sign could. The sawdust on the floor muffled footsteps, and the chatter of adults mixed with the steady thud of knives meeting wooden blocks. Payment was sometimes made on the spot, sometimes written down in the ledger to be settled later. Every cut had a story, from Sunday roasts to weekday stews, and the butcher always seemed to know which choice suited your pocketbook best. Leaving the shop, you carried more than a bundle of meat. You carried trust, familiarity, and the sense that you were part of something smaller and sturdier than what we know today. The dry goods store was another cornerstone of town life, a place where you could find nearly everything you needed if you knew where to look. The shelves held bolts of fabric, spools of thread, buttons in glass jars, and sturdy tools lined up in neat rows. I remember walking with Mama as she felt the fabric between her fingers, holding it up to the light to see how it might fall when stitched into a dress. The air carried the faint smell of cotton and wool, mixed with the sharp tang of linseed oil from the shelves of household supplies. A counter near the front displayed soaps wrapped in paper, while wooden bins held flour, rice, and beans that were scooped by measure into sacks. Nothing was rushed. The shopkeeper often lingered to ask about your family or the crops, leaning against the counter with a pencil behind his ear. The creak of the floorboards and the quiet hum of a ceiling fan added to the sense of calm that filled the store. It wasn't a place of endless choice, but one of careful selection, where every purchase mattered. Families came not only to buy, but to visit, to share a laugh, or to catch up on news. Looking back, I see that the dry goods store wasn't only about goods at all. It was about patience, community, and a slower pace of living, where what you bought was useful, lasting, and chosen with thought. By the time you left, arms heavy with parcels wrapped in paper and tied with twine, you felt as though you had not just shopped but taken part in the very life of the town itself. Mama's shopping list was a thing of quiet importance, written neatly on scraps of paper torn from old envelopes or the backs of church bulletins. She never wasted a word, just the essentials laid out in her steady hand. Flour, sugar, coffee, maybe a tin of cocoa if there was a little extra money that week. I can still picture her at the kitchen table with her pencil in hand, the smell of supper lingering in the air, thinking carefully about what was needed and what could wait until next time. Nothing was bought on a whim. She always said that every penny counted, and she meant it. The list was folded into her purse, and if she forgot it, she seemed half lost, retracing each step in her mind. At the store, she checked it often, pausing to cross off items as they were placed in the basket. There was no running back for one forgotten thing. What she bought had to last until the next trip, and so every choice carried weight. Sometimes she let me hold the list, a task I took seriously, feeling proud when I handed it back without losing it. That little slip of paper was more than just a reminder. It was a lesson in planning, in thrift, and in the care that went into keeping a household steady. Looking back, I realized that those lists were stitched with love, discipline, and the quiet strength of a mother making do. Each line told a story of meals, family, and the rhythm of life in a time when nothing came easy, but everything was valued. Running a tab at the store was common in those days, and it rested on something as simple as trust. Families who did not have the cash in hand could still bring home what they needed, with the grocer noting it down carefully in a worn ledger. I can still see the black book sitting near the register, its pages lined with names, numbers, and neat check marks made by the grocer's steady hand. When payday arrived, Mama or Daddy would stop by to settle the balance, sometimes sliding folded bills across the counter, sometimes a mix of bills and coins, always with a nod of thanks. There was no plastic card, no digital approval, only the weight of one's reputation and the unspoken agreement that your word was good. It carried a sense of honor that shaped the way people lived. You didn't buy what you couldn't repay, and the grocer didn't doubt your promise. For children, It was almost magical to see Mama walk out of the store with bags of food even when her purse seemed nearly empty, knowing that trust alone had opened the door. Those ledgers bound the community together, weaving a quiet net of responsibility and respect. To owe the store was nothing shameful as long as you paid when you could, and to pay in full was a moment of pride. It was an arrangement that spoke of a slower, steadier world, where honesty mattered as much as money and where the strength of a handshake could carry a family through lean weeks until wages were earned. The candy counter at the little store was a world of its own, glowing brighter in a child's eyes than any aisle ever could. Glass jars lined the shelves behind the counter, filled with peppermints, jawbreakers, licorice whips, and lollipops wrapped in cellophane that crinkled when unwrapped. A single penny was enough to claim a treasure, though the hardest part was choosing which one. I remember standing there with my nose nearly pressed against the glass, pointing at one sweet and then another, changing my mind more times than the clerk probably cared to count. The clerk would patiently scoop the candy into a small paper bag, rolling down the top and handing it over like it was gold. The store seemed quieter in those moments, as if even the grown-ups waiting nearby understood the weight of the choice. The candy wasn't just a treat. It was freedom, joy, and the thrill of being trusted to spend wisely. Sometimes Mama would surprise us with a nickel, and suddenly the possibilities widened like a field in springtime. You could share with a friend, or tuck a piece into your pocket to savor later, long after the sugar had faded from your tongue. That little counter held more magic than any towering display I've seen since. It wasn't about how much you bought. It was about the simple delight of something sweet, earned, chosen, and remembered long after the bag was empty. Shopping once followed the rhythm of the seasons, and the stores reflected it as naturally as the fields outside of town. In summer, straw hats and cotton dresses appeared in the windows, along with lemonade sets and lawn chairs that seemed made for front porches. Autumn brought heavier coats, canning jars stacked high, and burlap sacks filled with potatoes and apples. Winter shelves held galoshes, wool mittens, and thick socks, while the smell of pine and oranges seemed to drift through every corner. By spring, bolts of bright fabric lined the dry goods store, promising new dresses for Easter and lighter shirts for Sunday mornings. Nothing felt rushed or out of place. If you needed something out of season, you waited until it came around again, and that was simply how life worked. People planned, repaired, and reused until the right time returned. Those seasonal rhythms gave a kind of order to life, a dependable pattern that shaped both work and leisure. The sight of garden tools arriving in the hardware store meant planting wasn't far off, and the first sign of sleds in the window meant children would soon be laughing on the hills. Shopping carried an element of anticipation, a reminder that patience was part of living. It felt as though each season offered not just different goods but a renewed spirit, linking the store shelves to the turning of the year in a way that is hard to find now. The hardware store was a place that held a certain mystery for me as a child. Its aisles smelled of oil, metal, and sawdust, and every shelf seemed to groan under the weight of things I could not yet name. Rows of hammers, nails, screws, and bolts glinted in the light, each one carefully arranged in wooden drawers or glass cases. The man behind the counter often wore suspenders and had a pencil tucked behind his ear, ready to scribble down notes on slips of paper. He seemed to know exactly what you needed before you even finished describing it. My father would stride in with a problem in mind, perhaps a hinge that had rusted or a pipe that refused to fit, and the owner would nod knowingly, disappearing into the back and returning with just the right part. There was no scanning of barcodes or endless searching. Knowledge was passed from one man to another, the kind that came from years of handling tools and helping neighbors mend what was broken. I remember dragging my fingers along the bins of nails, marveling at how something so small could hold up barns, doors, and fences. The store was more than a place to buy supplies. It was a classroom, a gathering spot, and a lifeline for families who fixed instead of replaced. Walking out with a small bag of nails or a new wrench carried a sense of pride because it meant something would soon be working again. Window displays along Main Street were an art form in themselves, carefully arranged by hand to draw in the eye of every passerby. Before massive advertising budgets and bright screens, it was the painted signs, mannequins, and clever arrangements that did the convincing. I remember pressing my face close to the glass, fogging it with my breath as I admired dresses on mannequins or shiny new radios, propped up beside stacks of records. At Christmas time, the windows glowed with tinsel, lights, and toy trains running in careful circles, and children lingered long after their parents had called them away. In the summer, the baker set pies on display with lattice crusts that looked too perfect to eat, their sweet smell escaping each time the door opened. Even the shoe store carried its own kind of theater, with polished loafers perched on tiny stands and signs promising comfort and durability. The displays were not only about selling, they were about imagination, about painting a picture of what life could feel like if you stepped inside. They gave the town's Main Street a sense of wonder, as though each pane of glass was a little stage waiting to be admired. People didn't hurry past. They paused, chatted, and pointed things out to their children, weaving small moments of joy into the rhythm of errands. Looking back, I see those windows not only as advertisements but as gifts of beauty, crafted with care, meant to stop you for a breath in the middle of an ordinary day. Paper sacks and string bags were the common sight when shopping was done, long before plastic became the norm. Grocers packed items neatly into sturdy brown bags, folding the tops down tight so nothing spilled on the walk home. Some families brought their own mesh or cloth bags, worn from years of use, their handles stretched but dependable. I can still hear the sound of glass bottles clinking softly against each other as they rested in the sack, cushioned by cans of soup or a loaf of bread. Eggs were tucked carefully into cartons, sometimes carried separately so they wouldn't crack on the way back. People balanced their parcels with care, often walking home with bags tucked close against their sides or hanging from the crook of an arm. On rainy days, the paper bags grew soft, threatening to split open, and it was a small race to reach the porch before disaster struck. There was no thought of double bagging or tossing things away after one use. Bags were saved, folded, and used again to line trash bins, cover school books, or wrap leftovers. That kind of thrift wasn't considered unusual. It was simply how things were done. Carrying those paper sacks felt honest and plain, part of the rhythm of everyday life. There was something grounding in knowing that what you held had been packed by hand, measured by someone you likely knew, and meant to last until the next trip into town. It gave shopping a slower, more deliberate shape, one where even the way goods were carried spoke of resourcefulness and care. The catalog was a kind of dream book that landed in the mailbox with a heavy thud, its pages thick with possibility. Sears and Montgomery Ward printed those great volumes, and families treated them almost like holiday gifts when they arrived. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the glossy pages spread wide, as Mama circled household items she thought might be useful, and my brother and I flipped straight to the toy section. The catalog carried everything from clothes to furniture to farm tools, things far beyond the reach of our little town's shops. You could order a pair of boots or even a sewing machine and have it arrive weeks later by train or truck, wrapped and waiting at the post office. For children, the pictures were as good as magic, sparking daydreams of bicycles, dollhouses, and shiny radios. We knew not everything could be bought, but looking was part of the fun. Families saved those catalogs even after the seasons had changed, using them to trace patterns, clip out pictures, or even cut paper dolls. It was shopping and wishing combined, all pressed into one thick book that traveled across the country into living rooms like ours. The catalog reminded us that the world was larger than our Main Street and hinted at all the things just out of reach but still possible. It carried both the excitement of choice and the patience required to wait, a balance that shaped the way people dreamed of their homes and their lives. The shoe store carried a feeling of ceremony, especially when a new pair was needed for school or Sunday service. The air was thick with the smell of polished leather, and rows of sturdy shoes lined the walls, their laces tied in neat bows. A clerk would greet you with a smile and guide you to a chair where a low stool waited, polished from years of use. Children's feet were measured with a cold metal device that slid snugly around toes and heels, and it always made me wiggle, trying not to laugh. The clerk knelt patiently, sliding shoes on and pressing at the tips to check for growing room, while parents asked how long they might last before another pair would be needed. It wasn't about fashion or chasing the latest style. Shoes were chosen for durability, comfort, and the hope they would see you through a season without scuffs or holes. I remember Mama lifting me from the stool to take a few careful steps across the floor, the sound of stiff soles echoing as I tried to walk naturally. A new pair of shoes carried more than fresh leather. It carried pride, a sense of being ready for what lay ahead. Leaving with a box tucked under your arm felt like a milestone, a small piece of growing up, marked by careful choice and the quiet approval of a parent. The ritual was steady, predictable, and somehow sacred, as though shoes were not just bought but earned. Pharmacies in those days were far more than places to pick up prescriptions. They were gathering spots, bright with glass bottles on the shelves and the comforting smell of liniment, soap, and vanilla from the soda fountain. I remember stepping inside and hearing the gentle clink of dishes as someone stirred a milkshake or dropped a scoop of ice cream into a tall glass. While Mama spoke quietly with the pharmacist about cough syrup or aspirin, children perched on swivel stools at the counter, sipping cherry colas through paper straws. The pharmacist himself was often a trusted figure in town, someone who knew families by name and remembered their ailments without needing a chart. Behind him, rows of tiny drawers and carefully labeled bottles gave the place an air of both mystery and safety. Parents could pick up medicine, order a cream for a rash, and at the same time treat their children to a malted sundae. It was a kind of one-stop corner for health and comfort, though not in the modern sense. The soda fountain brought laughter and chatter, while the pharmacy counter carried quiet reassurance. Leaving that place often meant carrying not only a bottle or two of medicine, but also a softened heart from the small joys shared at the counter. The pharmacy reminded us that care and comfort could come together in the same space, binding the practical with the pleasurable, in a way that made it a landmark in town life. The five and dime was a treasure chest to children and adults alike, a place where the shelves seemed to hold a bit of everything and nothing cost more than a few coins. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the smell of popcorn from the small machine near the entrance filled the air. Counters displayed glass marbles, toy tops, and rubber balls that begged to be bounced, while further down you could find lace curtains, sewing needles, and picture frames. It was the kind of store where a child could spend an afternoon with only a quarter, weighing whether to buy a comic book, a slinky, or a bag of candy. I remember Mama standing near the housewares while I wandered the aisles, my hands itching to touch everything, though I knew better than to misbehave. Clerks were always nearby, friendly but watchful, ready to ring up a sale on their hand-cranked registers. What made the store so enchanting wasn't just the variety, but the feeling that you could discover something unexpected every time you walked in. People lingered there, talking with neighbors, admiring the newest goods, or simply enjoying the comfort of a familiar place. Leaving with a small brown bag in hand felt like carrying home a bit of joy, even if it was only filled with buttons or candy. The five and dime wasn't just about bargains. It was about wonder, discovery, and the happiness found in small, simple things. Receipts were not the printed slips we know today, but often handwritten notes, quickly scrawled by the clerk at the counter. I remember watching as they added the numbers in pencil on a small pad, the sound of lead scratching across the paper faster than I could follow. Sometimes they licked the tip of the pencil to keep the marks dark, then tore off the top sheet with a neat rip, handing it to Mama with a nod. The figures were often rounded, a few cents left off, or added in the name of simplicity. No one questioned the math because the trust between shopkeeper and customer was steady as stone. If a mistake was made, it was usually found and fixed with good humor rather than suspicion. Those slips of paper were folded and tucked into purses or pinned on kitchen corkboards until payday came around. I remember the way Mama saved them in a small tin, pulling them out to match with the entries she kept in her own ledger at home. The receipts were more than numbers. They were reminders of meals yet to be cooked, clothes yet to be sewn, and bills waiting to be paid. Each one carried the weight of hard-earned money and the evidence of careful choices. Holding that scrap of paper in your hand, with its faint smudge of graphite and sometimes the faint scent of tobacco from the clerk's fingers, gave you a sense that business had been done honestly and fairly. It was simple, human, and lasting in a way that long rolls of printed paper could never be. Trading stamps were a small thrill in everyday shopping, and I can still see the way Mama's eyes lit up when a clerk tucked a fresh strip into her bag. Each time you bought groceries or household goods, you received a handful of stamps to paste into special booklets. At home, Mama kept the booklets in a drawer, pulling them out after supper with a little dish of water to wet the backs. My brother and I helped her paste them in, careful to line them up straight on the faint gray squares. The glue left our fingers sticky, and sometimes a page would wrinkle, but it felt like we were building towards something important. When a booklet was filled, Mama tucked it neatly aside until she had enough to take to the redemption center, a modest place filled with shelves of dishes, lamps, toasters, and toys. I remember the day she exchanged her filled booklets for a new set of mixing bowls, carrying them home with a smile that made the effort worthwhile. Those stamps gave families a sense of saving without money leaving the pocket, and children learned patience by watching the pages slowly fill. It was not instant gratification, but the quiet joy of working toward a goal, one stamp at a time. Looking back, it seems almost quaint, but at the time it carried real excitement, a reminder that small bits of effort could be stitched together into something useful and lasting. The fabric store was a place where color and texture filled every corner, and it always seemed alive with chatter. Bolts of cloth stood upright like soldiers, their patterns ranging from plain calico to bright florals that seemed to promise a new dress or apron. Mama often brought me along when she needed material, and I remember how she would pinch the fabric between her fingers, holding it up to the light to judge its weight. The women in the store did the same, leaning close to compare textures or whispering advice about what would wear well. There was always the hum of scissors slicing across the cutting table, followed by the sound of fabric folding neatly into stacks. Buttons glittered in little glass jars, while zippers and spools of thread lined the shelves like a rainbow. The store carried more than cloth. It carried the plans and dreams of households where sewing was as common as cooking. Mama often chatted with other women about patterns and prices, their voices low but warm. A small community formed right there among the aisles. Sometimes the clerk would slip a scrap of cloth into my hand, a small piece too short to sell but perfect for a doll dress. Leaving the store with paper-wrapped bundles tied in string always carried a sense of possibility, as though the raw pieces of fabric would soon become something made with care and worn with pride. Those afternoons taught me that clothing wasn't just bought. It was chosen, shaped, and stitched, a process that tied patience and skill into the fabric of everyday life. Shopping on credit in those years was less about paperwork and more about faith between neighbors. Families could walk into a store with little more than a promise, and the owner would write the purchase into his ledger without hesitation. I remember watching the grocer dip his pen in ink or scribble with his pencil, the page already lined with familiar names. Sometimes Mama would leave with bags of flour, coffee and soap when her purse held only a few coins, her cheeks a bit flushed but her head held high. She always made sure to settle her bill when Daddy's wages came, and the grocer never doubted that she would. That kind of trust formed a bond stronger than any contract. To owe was understood, and to repay was a matter of honor. It tied the store and the family together, not as strangers in a transaction, but as members of the same community. Children like me sensed the weight of that trust even if we didn't fully grasp it. It felt remarkable that words and reputation could carry as much value as cash. And in many ways, it taught us more about honesty than sermons ever could. Looking back, I see that it wasn't just credit. It was a lifeline during lean weeks and a reminder that people relied on one another in ways that extended far beyond the counters and shelves of the store. The department store in town was nothing like the vast halls we know today, but to us it felt grand just the same. It was usually housed in a tall brick building with wide front windows polished until they gleamed. Inside, the wooden floors shone with wax, and soft music drifted faintly from a radio perched behind the counter. Escalators were rare in our part of the country, but when we visited a larger town that had them, I remember the thrill of stepping on, the floor moving beneath my feet as if by magic. Counters displayed hats, gloves, and scarves, while further back you could find housewares and children's clothing neatly folded in stacks. Clerks were dressed smartly and spoke with a kind of formality that made you stand a little straighter. Shopping there was not an everyday affair but an occasion, sometimes tied to holidays or special needs like a new coat for winter. Even if you left with only a small parcel, the feeling lingered that you had stepped into a place of refinement. The store carried not only goods but an air of pride for the town, as though having such a place meant you belonged to something a little larger, a little finer. For children, the gleam of polished counters and the smell of new cloth stirred daydreams of city life. Though for most of us it was just a brief taste before returning to simpler routines. Those visits remain sharp in my memory, reminders that even modest stores once carried a sense of wonder. The farm supply shop was as essential to the community as any grocer or hardware store, though its shelves told a different story. Walking inside, you were met with the earthy scent of feed, grain, and leather, a mix that clung to your clothes long after you left. Tall sacks of seed leaned against the walls, their printed labels bright with pictures of corn or wheat. Wooden barrels held nails, rope, and other supplies, while shelves offered everything from lantern wicks to rubber boots. Farmers lingered there, not just to buy, but to talk, swapping news about weather, harvests, and livestock. The storekeeper often joined in, leaning against the counter, offering advice on which seed had done well or which tool would hold up through a season. For children, it was a place of curiosity, full of odd smells and heavy tools that seemed larger than life. I remember my father hoisting a sack of feed onto his shoulder as though it weighed nothing, while I trailed behind with a small box of nails clutched proudly in my arms. Purchases were practical, meant to keep a farm running and a family fed, but the conversations were just as valuable. The farm supply shop was a gathering place as much as a store, where lessons were traded as freely as goods. Looking back, I see that it tied the rural families together, reminding everyone that no one worked alone, and that shared knowledge was as vital as any item stacked on the shelves. The smell of leather was the first thing that met you when stepping into the shoe repair shop or the tack store, a deep and lasting scent that seemed to seep into the very walls. Rows of saddles, harnesses, and belts hung neatly, polished until they gleamed, while the cobbler's bench was scattered with tools worn smooth from years of use. You could hear the steady tap of a hammer striking nails into soles, a rhythm as reliable as a heartbeat. People brought in shoes with worn heels or split seams, knowing they would come back strong enough to last another season. There was pride in saving a pair of shoes rather than discarding them, a sense that care and repair were virtues. For farmers, the tack shop was just as important, offering straps, buckles, and the means to keep their horses working steady. I remember watching the cobbler fit a new sole, his hands sure and steady, while he explained how it would hold through mud and snow. He often looked up with a smile, reminding customers that leather had a life of its own if treated with respect. The shop smelled of polish, oil, and wood smoke from the stove in the corner, a blend that carried comfort. It was a place that reminded everyone of the value of endurance, where nothing was wasted, and each stitch carried a story of labor, thrift, and skill. Store owners were not distant figures hidden behind offices or corporate logos. They were neighbors who lived on the same streets, sat in the same pews at church, and waved as they passed your house on their evening walks. The man who measured out your flour might be the same one who checked on you when a storm knocked down trees, and the woman who sold cloth on Saturday could be seen hanging laundry across her own line on Monday morning. There was no separation between business and community, for the two were woven tightly together. When Mama walked into the store, the owner often asked after Grandma Elsie, or wondered how Charlie was getting along at school. Such conversations weren't small talk. They were a continuation of life that spilled from home into shop and back again. That closeness built trust, the kind that made credit possible and kindness expected. If someone fell behind on payments, the storekeeper knew their story and offered patience rather than judgment. Births, weddings, and even illnesses were acknowledged across the counter, often with a quiet word or a hand resting gently on an arm. The store was not just a business, but a shared thread in the fabric of the town. Looking back, I see how much comfort came from knowing that those who provided your goods were also part of your days, your joys, and your struggles. It created a sense of belonging that went far beyond any transaction. Shelves in small-town stores often carried goods that came straight from the hands of neighbors rather than distant factories. Jars of honey with labels scribbled in ballpoint pen sat beside sacks of flour, and baskets of eggs sometimes rested near the counter, their shells still dusted with straw. I remember the sight of homemade preserves lined up neatly, ruby red strawberry, jam, and golden peach, each sealed with a layer of wax and offered for sale to folks who trusted the care that went into them. These items were not special displays or limited runs. They were part of everyday commerce, exchanged with the same ease as soap or sugar. Buying them meant you were supporting a farmer down the road or a neighbor who spent evenings stirring pots in her kitchen. It carried a sense of pride, a reminder that the community sustained itself with its own hands. Mama always said those jars tasted better because they carried more than fruit. They carried the effort and heart of someone you might see at church or sitting on the bleachers at the Friday night game. There was honesty in those shelves, a plain reminder that food and goods had roots you could trace, not hidden behind labels and brands. Bringing home such things made meals feel more personal, more connected, as though each bite held a story. Looking back, those shelves spoke quietly of self-reliance, generosity, and the closeness of a community that fed itself with both labor and love. Payday Fridays gave the town a kind of electricity you could almost feel in the air. Men left work with envelopes tucked in their shirt pockets or folded bills in their wallets. And by late afternoon, the stores grew busy. The grocer's bell hardly stopped ringing as families filed in to settle their accounts, pay down what was written in the ledger, and fill their baskets for the week ahead. I remember the sound of coins clinking on the counter, the soft rustle of bills being counted, and the nod of satisfaction from the storekeeper as he marked the ledger clean. Children tugged at sleeves, eager for a small treat once the serious business was done, and many mothers allowed a piece of candy or a comic book as a reward. The aisles felt more crowded, voices louder, neighbors stopping to greet one another while balancing sacks of flour and tins of coffee. There was relief in those evenings, a sense of fresh beginning as cupboards were stocked and debts made right. Supper at home on a payday often felt brighter, with perhaps a bit of meat on the table or a pie bought from the bakery. The glow of those evenings came not from luxury, but from the simple comfort of knowing the household was provided for, at least until the next Friday rolled around. Payday gave rhythm to the week and stitched the community together, each family sharing in the same cycle of work, waiting, and reward. Delivery boys on bicycles were a familiar sight, weaving through the streets with baskets strapped to the front of their bikes, heavy with groceries or parcels. Some carried crates of milk or bundles of bread. Others balanced sacks of potatoes or paper bags filled with soap, coffee, and sugar. The boys pedaled hard, often with caps pulled low and pant legs rolled up to keep from catching in the chain. I remember hearing the squeak of tires as one stopped in front of our house, propping his bike against the porch rail while he carried the bags up the steps. The groceries were handed over with a quick grin, sometimes followed by a short whistle as he sped away to his next stop. Families who lived too far to walk, or who had small children at home, counted on those deliveries. It was more than convenience. It was a lifeline, especially during winter storms, when the streets were buried and walking was nearly impossible. Mama always left a kind word or a cookie for the delivery boy, knowing the work was tiring and the pay was small. Looking back, those boys stitched the town together one trip at a time, carrying not only goods but also the quiet assurance that even when you could not make it to the store could still come to you. Their bicycles, baskets, and endless energy were part of the rhythm of daily life, proof that service was once a neighborly duty more than a business venture. The milk and bread trucks were steady visitors in neighborhoods, their early morning rattles and soft footsteps marking the start of the day. I can still hear the clinking of glass bottles as the milkman set them gently on the porch, cream floating to the top beneath the paper caps. Bread was delivered in wax-wrapped loaves, still soft and smelling faintly of yeast, tucked into a metal box by the door or handed directly if someone was waiting. These deliveries felt ordinary then, but they carried a quiet luxury, sparing families a trip into town and ensuring that breakfast could always be made. Children sometimes hurried out in their pajamas to wave at the driver, who often had a friendly word or a piece of gum to share. The milkman and the breadman were more than workers. They were familiar faces, part of the rhythm of a household, trusted with leaving food at your door without needing a lock or signature. Mama rinsed and set the empty bottles back out, ready for the next round. Nothing wasted, everything reused. It was a system that seemed simple, built on routine and trust, and it worked beautifully. Looking back, those quiet deliveries remind me of a time when even the most ordinary acts felt personal, when food wasn't just bought but brought, when the start of each day was softened by the sound of bottles meeting wood and the smell of bread fresh at dawn. Coupons were small slips of hope tucked between the pages of the local newspaper, clipped carefully by mothers who knew the value of every cent. I remember Mama at the kitchen table, scissors in hand, trimming the edges neatly before stacking them in a small envelope she kept in her purse. Each coupon carried the promise of a little saved, maybe a few cents off a bag of flour or a tin of coffee. It didn't seem like much, but over time it mattered, and families took pride in stretching their money as far as it would go. At the store, clerks counted them one by one, tucking them beneath the cash drawer with a nod. Sometimes neighbors traded coupons with each other, swapping those they didn't need for ones that matched their lists. Children often helped with the cutting, feeling important as they sorted the slips into piles, their fingers smudged with ink from the newspaper. Using a coupon felt like a small victory, a reminder that thrift was not only wise but also necessary. Looking back, those bits of paper represented more than savings. They represented discipline, patience, and the quiet skill of managing a household with care. It was a practice that taught children the worth of money and showed that resourcefulness was a strength, not a burden. The rustle of clipped coupons and the sight of Mama tucking them neatly into her purse remain vivid in my memory. Part of the ordinary magic of making ends meet, the barber shop was as much a part of a shopping trip as the grocery or the hardware store. a place where men and boys gathered not just for haircuts but for news and conversation. The scent of shaving cream and talc hung in the air, mingling with the faint tang of hair tonic. Wooden chairs lined the wall, filled with farmers, workers, and young boys waiting their turn, each flipping through dog-eared magazines or listening to the easy banter that flowed as freely as the snip of scissors. The barber's chair itself was a throne, its leather worn smooth, its footrest polished by countless shoes. I remember climbing into it, a striped cape snapped around my neck, and the tickle of clippers buzzing close to my ears. For the grown men, the barber shop was a gathering place, where weather, crops, and town news were shared in voices that carried both humor and seriousness. Some came for a shave, leaning back while the barber's straight razor glided carefully, the sound of the strop echoing as the blade was sharpened. Leaving with a fresh haircut meant more than neat edges. It carried a sense of pride and belonging, a reminder that you were part of the steady rhythm of town life. For children, the barber shop was a rite of passage. And for fathers, it was a chance to pause, sit still, and share a word or two with neighbors. Looking back, it was never only about hair. It was about community, stories, and the comfort of knowing that in that small room, you were never a stranger. The town square was the true center of life, its courthouse standing tall with shops, diners, and benches spread around it like spokes on a wheel. Saturdays were when it came alive, the sidewalks crowded with families carrying paper sacks, children chasing one another around the fountain, and farmers leaning against trucks while they talked about weather and markets. The air carried a mix of scents, from fried onions drifting out of the diner to the sweet pull of fresh bread cooling in the bakery window. Benches along the square filled quickly, old men tipping their hats while women compared notes on recipes or the best price of fabric. The square wasn't only a place to buy. It was where people paused, lingered, and belonged, where neighbors were sure to meet without planning, and where news spread faster than any paper could carry it. On holidays, the square dressed itself in bunting and flags, and on summer nights, the glow of street lamps cast long shadows as couples strolled after supper. Even the sound of the clock striking from the courthouse tower seemed to tie the rhythm of the town together, each chime echoing across brick streets. Looking back, the square held more than commerce. It held fellowship, a sense of belonging that no wide parking lot or endless aisle could ever replace. It was the beating heart of the community, steady and unassuming, yet rich with memory. Seasonal sales gave the year its own small excitements, and families planned around them the way they planned around holidays. After Christmas, white sails filled the windows with neatly folded sheets and towels stacked in tidy pyramids, tempting mothers who had been making do with worn linens all year. As autumn approached, store shelves displayed pencils, notebooks, and sturdy shoes, signaling the return of school before a single leaf had turned. Spring brought bolts of bright cloth at lowered prices, encouraging women to sew new dresses for Easter and Sunday outings. These sales were not about extravagance, but about timing, stretching $1 by buying when the store could offer a little less cost. Mama always had an eye for them, watching the newspaper for hand-drawn ads that announced a bargain. I remember her satisfaction when she brought home a set of towels that had cost less than expected. Her pride as real as if she had won a prize. Children shared in the excitement too, for a back-to-school sale often meant a new lunchbox or fresh crayons with sharp points. There was anticipation in those sales, a reminder that patience paid off, that waiting for the right time could make a household run smoother. Looking back, they seemed simple, yet they carried weight, stitching themselves into the rhythm of the seasons as surely as the planting of gardens or the first frost of winter. Easter always carried with it the tradition of new shoes, and for many children, it was the highlight of spring. I remember Mama leading me into the shoe store, the polished floor reflecting rows of shiny patent leathers for girls and sturdy loafers for boys. The clerk would kneel with his measuring tool, sliding it gently along my foot while Mama watched closely, determined that the pair would last through both church services and Sunday visits. The smell of leather mixed with polish filled the air as I tried on shoes that squeaked with each step across the floor. Some pinched at the toes, others felt too loose, and Mama always pressed her thumb down to check the space at the end. Once the right pair was found, there was a small thrill in carrying the box home, the shoes wrapped in crisp tissue that crackled with every touch. Wearing them on Easter morning felt special, as though they were part of the celebration itself. Paired with a pressed dress or neatly ironed trousers, the shoes shone in the sunlight as families walked up the church steps, each child proud of their newness. Looking back, it wasn't only about footwear. It was about tradition, a marker of the season that spoke of care, sacrifice, and the joy of being made ready for a day that carried meaning far beyond its fashion. Those shoes, often scuffed by summer's end, remain in memory as symbols of renewal, faith, and the quiet pride of a family doing its best. Christmas shopping in those days filled the town with a kind of magic that had little to do with how much you spent and everything to do with the spirit of the season. Store windows glowed with strands of colored lights, their displays dressed in tinsel and artificial snow that sparkled under the street lamps. Inside, clerks handed out candy canes to children, while parents browsed shelves of toys, dolls, and board games, their choices thoughtful rather than hurried. I remember the hush of the dry goods store as Mama fingered bolts of flannel, choosing enough to sew pajamas for us, while Daddy slipped a box of chocolates onto the counter for her when he thought no one was looking. The air smelled of pine from wreaths hung on doors, mingled with the sweet scent of oranges stacked in crates, a once-a-year treat. Families saved for weeks to afford even a handful of gifts, and each one was treasured, wrapped carefully in paper saved from the year before. The whole town seemed to slow down as carols drifted from radios behind counters and neighbors wished each other joy. It wasn't about abundance, but about the weight each gift carried, chosen with care, given with love. Looking back, those Christmas shopping trips remain bright in memory, filled with warmth, togetherness, and the quiet magic of believing that something small could be made wonderful. Layaway was a word that carried both patience and hope, a system that allowed families to dream a little bigger without overreaching. I remember Mama choosing a set of dishes she couldn't afford all at once, speaking quietly with the clerk who pulled out a special pad of paper. The dishes were carried to the back room and placed on a shelf marked with our name, waiting until enough payments were made to bring them home. Each week, Mama would stop by to add a few bills or coins, the balance shrinking little by little. For children, it felt like a hidden treasure, knowing something wonderful sat just out of sight, waiting for the day it would finally belong to us. When that day came, the clerk brought the box forward with a smile, and Mama's pride filled the room as she lifted it into her arms. Layaway taught us that waiting was part of life, that good things came not from haste but from persistence and care. It gave families the dignity of buying without debt and the joy of watching a dream grow closer each time a payment was made. Looking back, I see how much meaning those purchases carried. They were not simply things bought. They were things earned, each one marked by sacrifice, patience, and the deep satisfaction of carrying something home that had been waited for and wanted with all the heart. The hardware store was more than a place to buy nails and tools. It was a school of sorts, where advice came as freely as the goods stacked on the shelves. I remember standing beside my father as he explained a leaky faucet or a door that would not shut right, and the owner would nod thoughtfully before reaching for just the right part. He rarely sold you more than you needed, and often added a word or two about how to make the repair last. Sometimes he sketched a quick diagram on a scrap of paper, his pencil moving fast as he explained the steps. The shop smelled of oil, wood, and metal, and the air seemed to hum with usefulness. Men leaned on the counter not only to make purchases but to share stories, compare methods, and learn from one another. For families who fixed things rather than replacing them, that advice was as valuable as any tool. It gave people confidence to mend what was broken, to keep homes and barns standing strong. I remember the look of pride on my father's face when he left with only a small bag in hand, knowing that within hours the problem would be solved. The store was not just a business, it was a place of shared knowledge, where solutions were passed down like heirlooms, stitched into the life of the community. Looking back, I realize that the real worth of that store was not in its stock, but in the wisdom offered over the counter. Where learning came with every purchase, the bakery on Main Street could be found by its smell long before you reached its door. Warm bread carried on the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of sugar and cinnamon, and it drew people in like a magnet. I remember pressing my nose to the glass, staring at rows of loaves stacked neatly, their crusts golden and crackling. Behind the counter, trays of rolls, pies, and cookies were set out fresh each morning, the baker moving quickly with flour dusting his apron. Families often stopped by after shopping at the grocer, slipping a loaf of rye or a sack of rolls into their arms before heading home. On Fridays, Mama sometimes treated us to a pie, the box tied with string that cut gently into her fingers as she carried it. The bakery was not only about food, it was about comfort, about walking into a place where the air itself seemed to feed you. Neighbors met there, chatting while they waited their turn, the sound of laughter mixing with the steady scrape of the bread knife. Even the simplest purchase felt special, and the first slice of bread at supper was eaten almost in silence, everyone pausing to enjoy it. Looking back, the bakery was a kind of anchor in the week, its scents and flavors marking moments of joy in the steady rhythm of life. It reminded us that nourishment could be more than necessity. It could be delight, shared across a table with those you loved. The sound of a cash register in those days had a music of its own, sharp and bright, nothing like the quiet hum of machines now. I remember standing by the counter, waiting as the clerk pressed the metal keys, each one clattering loudly before the drawer slid open with a ding that seemed to ring across the whole store. Coins clinked as they were counted, dropped into little compartments worn smooth by years of use, while paper bills were stacked neatly, their edges soft from passing through so many hands. Sometimes the clerk jotted figures on a scrap of paper before giving Mama her change, and there was always a small nod as the coins landed in her palm. That sound of ringing, counting, and folding carried a weight of honesty, a moment where every transaction felt seen and complete. For a child, it was mesmerizing, like watching a performance. The rhythm steady and satisfying. The register was not only a tool, it was a heartbeat of the store, marking each sale with a cheerful note, reminding families that what they took home was paid for and trusted. Looking back, that simple ding holds more memory than all the quiet beeps of scanners today. It spoke of a world where business was personal, where money was exchanged face to face, and where the smallest sounds could signal the turning of another page in the life of the community. Tailor and seamstress shops were quiet havens tucked along the main streets, their windows filled with mannequins draped in half-finished dresses or suits waiting for a final fitting. The air inside was rich with the scent of pressed wool and cotton, warmed by the hiss of an iron moving steadily across cloth. I remember watching the tailor bend low, a tape measure draped around his neck, chalk marks on fabric guiding every careful stitch. Women came in carrying patterns folded inside envelopes, their voices mingling as they discussed hems, sleeves, and fabric that would stand the test of time. Men stopped by to have trousers taken in or jackets patched rather than replaced, trusting the skill of hands that worked with needle and thread faster than most could follow. The sound of scissors slicing through cloth was sharp and sure, a sound that carried both finality and promise. For children, the shop often meant standing still while pins were adjusted along pant legs, an itchy reminder of the patience required for good work. Those shops kept wardrobes alive long past what store-bought goods could manage, turning frayed collars into renewed shirts and giving dresses a second season of life. Looking back, they were not simply businesses, but guardians of thrift, proving that care and craft could stretch a dollar and keep families clothed with pride. Each garment that left those doors carried more than stitches. It carried the mark of skill, tradition, and the belief that nothing worth having should ever be wasted. Children were never forgotten in those little shops, for clerks often had small ways of making errands feel like adventures. I remember standing by the counter with Mama, tugging at her sleeve as the grocer weighed out flour, only to be distracted by a balloon tied to a basket, or a lollipop slipped quietly into my hand. Those treats were not expected, yet they became part of the memory of shopping, the kind of kindness that stitched joy into ordinary days. Some clerks kept jars of hard candy near the register, offering one piece to each child who waited patiently, while others folded a small paper hat from the receipt slip and placed it proudly on a child's head. It was their way of keeping little ones content while parents finished their business. But it was more than distraction. It was a gesture that reminded families they were welcome. For children, it made errands less of a chore and more of an outing, a chance to leave the store with something of their own. I can still taste the sticky sweetness of a peppermint melting on my tongue, the sound of the store fading as I concentrated on making it last. Looking back, those simple gifts were worth more than their size suggested. They carried the spirit of neighborliness, proof that even in commerce there was room for kindness, and that a child's wide smile was as important as the tally written in the ledger. Saturday often meant more than errands. For many families, shopping trips ended with a walk to the movie theater for the afternoon matinee. I remember the way the town seemed to shift as people left the grocery, the hardware, or the five and dime and drifted toward the bright marquee at the end of the street. Children clutched small paper bags of candy bought earlier, their excitement rising with each step. The theater itself smelled of buttered popcorn, the kind that left grease on your fingers and flavored the air long after the last bite. Inside, the lights dimmed, the curtain pulled back, and the flicker of the projector cast its spell. For a child, it felt as though shopping and entertainment had joined hands, making the day complete. Parents saw it differently, of course. It was a reward for patience in the stores, a way to rest after hours of errands. Sometimes we met neighbors there, our laughter mingling as we shared the same rows of seats, the glow of the screen binding us together. Leaving the theater as the sun set, arms heavy with groceries and hearts light from the film, felt like the perfect ending to a Saturday. Looking back, those matinees stitched themselves into the fabric of small-town life, turning simple errands into memories that carried both work and joy in equal measure. Errands in town often blended into small pleasures, and none was sweeter than the mix of the barber pole and the ice cream cone. I remember watching that striped pole turn slowly in the sunlight, its colors spiraling endlessly, marking the shop where men gathered for trims and shaves. After a haircut, especially for children, the promise of ice cream made the itchy collar and clipped hair bearable. Just down the street, the soda fountain or corner stand served cones piled high with vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry, their tops threatening to melt before the first lick. The taste of cold ice cream on a warm day seemed to wash away the seriousness of sitting still in the barber's chair. Families often paired the two stops together, the sharp smell of hair tonic giving way to the sweet scent of waffle cones as the afternoon stretched on. These little traditions stitched errands into outings, softening chores with treats and laughter. I can still recall the joy of holding a cone in one hand, hair freshly trimmed, the sound of voices and footsteps echoing through the town square. Looking back, it was not just about sweets or neat hair. It was about the rhythm of simple pleasures, the way even small rituals gave shape to childhood. and made ordinary days feel like occasions worth remembering. Store credit in those years was not about cards or contracts, but about reputation and trust. A man could walk into the hardware store, ask for nails and a hammer, and walk out with both even if he had no cash in his pocket. The clerk would jot a note in the ledger, confident that the debt would be settled when wages arrived. To fail to pay was more than financial trouble. It meant damaging your good name, something no family wished to risk. Honesty and reliability were as valuable as currency, and people guarded them carefully. I remember Mama whispering about how Mr. Luby had once vouched for a young man who was new in town, and the grocer honored that word without hesitation. That kind of trust built invisible threads across the community, binding people together in ways that went beyond simple trade. It also meant families learned to be careful, to take only what they knew they could repay. For children, watching these exchanges taught lessons about responsibility long before we could understand figures in a ledger. Looking back, store credit wasn't just a business arrangement. It was a covenant of faith between neighbors, a belief that people would do right by one another, even when times were thin. The post office was another stop woven into the rhythm of shopping trips, standing proudly near the square with its flag waving in the breeze. Stepping inside, you were greeted by the smell of ink and paper, along with the low hum of voices as neighbors collected their mail. Rows of brass mailboxes with tiny glass windows glinted under the lights, each one marked by a small key that seemed to hold a touch of importance. I remember Mama lifting the flap of our box, pulling out envelopes, and sometimes a thick catalog that made the whole trip feel worthwhile. Buying stamps was a ritual in itself, with the clerk tearing a strip from a sheet and sliding it carefully across the counter. People lingered in line, not only for letters but for the chance to exchange news, to ask after families, or to share a laugh before heading home. The post office was more than a place of business. It was a meeting ground, a thread that connected our small town to the wider world beyond the fields. Letters carried tidings from relatives far away, postcards brought glimpses of places we had never seen, and packages wrapped in twine carried surprises that filled households with delight. Looking back, I see the post office not just as a building, but as a symbol of connection, proof that even in a quiet town, voices and stories traveled far and found their way back again. The hardware store carried its own perfume, a mixture of oil, sawdust, and sharpened metal that clung to your clothes long after you left. I remember how the air seemed heavy with it, as if every nail, hinge, and length of pipe contributed its own scent to the whole. Wooden bins of loose nails and screws gave off a faint tang of iron, while the shelves lined with varnish and linseed oil released a sharper edge. Men who worked with their hands felt at home there, their boots tracking in the smell of earth and grease to mingle with it. For a child, the scent carried a sense of mystery, promising tools and fixes beyond my understanding. Standing close to my father as he talked with the shopkeeper, I would breathe it in, feeling as though I had stepped into a place where problems became solutions. That smell was reassurance, proof that broken things could be mended, that life had the tools for every task, if you knew where to look. Even now, the faintest trace of oil or sawdust can carry me back to that narrow store with its counters worn smooth and its windows fogged from the heat of the stove in winter. It was more than fragrance. It was identity, a signature that told you where you stood before a single word was spoken. Looking back, I realize it was the scent of work, of usefulness, of the quiet pride found in building and repairing with one's own two hands. Back porch deliveries were common in those days, and they carried a quiet trust that feels almost unthinkable now. I remember hearing the soft knock or the scrape of a wooden crate being set down on the steps, the sound of a truck pulling away before anyone even came to the door. Grocers often sent out a boy or two to carry sacks of flour, jars of pickles, or a box of fruit, leaving them neatly arranged where families could find them later. Payment was already settled or recorded in the store's ledger, so there was no fuss, no need for signatures or receipts. The goods simply waited there, safe under the shade of the porch roof. Sometimes the neighbor's dog would sniff at the boxes, but everyone knew enough to leave them untouched. Mama often said that a porch filled with groceries was as much a sign of community as it was of convenience. It meant you belonged to a place where people respected one another's needs and property. For children, finding those deliveries felt like a small wonder, as though the porch itself had provided supper. I still recall opening a crate to find apples shining in the afternoon light, their smell filling the air before we even carried them inside. Looking back, porch deliveries were not just about saving time. They were about faith in your neighbors, proof that life ran on trust, and that nourishment could arrive quietly, carried by familiar hands, and left waiting where it was most needed. Homemade shopping bags were a common sight, stitched from scraps of fabric or crocheted from sturdy yarn, each one showing the care of the hands that made it. Families used them again and again, folding them neatly into drawers or hanging them on hooks by the back door. I remember Mama's favorite, sewn from faded flour sacks with little blue flowers still visible along the seams. She carried it to the store week after week, proud of its strength and the fact that it cost nothing but time and effort. Some neighbors crocheted bags that stretched to hold a surprising number of goods, the loops widening with each bottle or loaf tucked inside. The bags grew softer with use, the fabric worn smooth by countless trips, and sometimes a corner had to be patched to keep it alive for another season. Children often helped carry them, their small arms straining under the weight, but learning early the importance of reusing what you had. Unlike the endless plastic of today, those bags had history stitched into them, every stain and fray telling a story of meals carried home and weeks made easier. Looking back, they were not just containers. They were symbols of thrift, patience, and creativity, proof that families could find ways to make the ordinary both useful and lasting. Even now, when I see a simple cloth bag, I think of Mama's hands guiding the needle, shaping something practical out of what others might have thrown away. Shopping was never rushed in those years, for it carried as much of a social thread as it did a practical one. People lingered in stores, leaning against counters while catching up on news about families, weather, or crops. Neighbors who hadn't spoken since church the week before might meet in the aisle, exchanging recipes or sharing word of a wedding or illness. I remember standing by Mama's side as she spoke with Miss Crandall at the grocer, the two of them laughing so long that I nearly forgot we had come for bread. Children wandered in and out of the conversation, sometimes playing together while parents finished their lists. Clerks were patient, never hurrying customers along, for they understood that these conversations were as much a part of the business as weighing flour or cutting cheese. The store itself felt alive, buzzing with voices that wove the town together. When families returned home, they carried not only their groceries, but also the comfort of knowing what was happening in the lives around them. Shopping was a reminder that you were not alone, that your life was tied to those around you, and that community was built not only in church pews or schoolhouses, but in the everyday act of choosing food and supplies. Looking back, I realized that those errands were less about necessity and more about connection, proof that even simple tasks could become threads in the larger fabric of belonging. The bookstore in town was small, but stepping inside felt like entering another world. Shelves reached nearly to the ceiling, filled with paperbacks whose spines cracked softly when opened, and hardcovers that smelled of ink and glue. Magazines sat in neat stacks near the front, their glossy covers promising glimpses of fashion, farming, or far-off cities. I remember how quiet it felt compared to the bustle of the grocer or the five and dime, as though voices softened out of respect for the words resting on those shelves. Children huddled over comic books while adults thumbed through novels, cookbooks, or hymnals, each person lost in their own corner of discovery. The storekeeper often suggested titles, pulling a volume down and explaining it with the kind of care usually reserved for close friends. For a few coins, you could walk out with a story that might carry you through long winter evenings or teach you something new. Even if you didn't buy, browsing felt like an adventure, filling your imagination with the promise of places and ideas far beyond the edges of town. Looking back, the bookstore was more than a shop. It was a doorway, a reminder that knowledge and wonder were within reach, waiting on the shelves for anyone willing to pause and look. Children waiting in cars while parents ran quick errands was a common sight, and I can still picture it plain as day. We sat in the back seat with the windows rolled down, the summer air thick with the smell of gasoline and dust from the street. Sometimes Mama left a bottle of soda or a small paper sack of peanuts to keep us occupied. And we made games out of counting the cars that passed or guessing how long she would be gone. The radio might hum softly if Daddy had left it on, filling the car with music that skipped between stations when the signal grew weak. On cold days, we huddled together under coats, our breath fogging the glass while we traced patterns with our fingers. Though the minutes dragged, there was a sense of independence in being trusted to wait, even if we were restless. I remember watching people pass on the sidewalk, their arms full of bags, and feeling the whole town moving around us. When Mama finally returned, the car filled with the scent of groceries, warm bread, or sometimes a hidden treat she had tucked into the sack. Looking back, those waits in the car weren't glamorous, but they are stitched into memory as part of the rhythm of shopping. Small lessons in patience and trust that belong to another time. Clerks often wore pencils tucked behind their ears, a simple habit that spoke of the work they did each day. I can still see the quick motion as a clerk pulled the pencil free, scribbling numbers on a scrap of paper, his lips moving silently as he added totals in his head. The scratch of graphite was steady and sure, far faster than I could follow. And with a few swift strokes, the cost of groceries or fabric was written clear. Sometimes the paper was so thin the numbers pressed through, leaving faint marks on the sheet below. Customers trusted the arithmetic, knowing the clerk's reputation mattered as much as the goods on the shelves. A smile often followed the tally. And change was counted back coin by coin, laid neatly into Mama's hand. There was a rhythm to it, the pencil sliding behind the ear again as the next person stepped forward. For children, it looked like a kind of magic, turning cans and sacks into figures that guided what went home. No one rushed, and no machine beeped to signal approval. It was simply people, pencils, and trust. Looking back, that pencil was more than a tool. It was a mark of diligence, a symbol of the honest labor that tied families to their stores and clerks to their communities. The Ice House was one of those places that seemed both ordinary and extraordinary, a building that carried the cool heart of the town long before freezers were common in every kitchen. I remember walking past it on hot afternoons, a faint chill seeping from the heavy doors even as the summer sun pressed down on the street. Inside, great blocks of ice were stacked in sawdust, their surfaces glistening and slowly dripping, a miracle of cold in a world where heat was often relentless. Men with thick gloves and strong backs moved those blocks with iron tongs, hoisting them into wagons or onto trucks, their arms straining but steady. Families would buy smaller chunks to keep food fresh in their ice boxes at home, wrapping them in burlap to slow the melting. I can still recall the sound of ice being chipped down to size, the sharp crack of metal against frozen crystal, and the way shards scattered across the floor like glass. Children were sometimes given a sliver to suck on, the cold burning their tongues but filling them with delight. The smell inside was damp and earthy from the sawdust, a strange contrast to the clean sharpness of the ice itself. For many households, that block of ice was as essential as flour or bread, keeping milk from souring and meat safe for another day or two. Trips to the ice house felt like stepping into another season. Winter stored up and rationed out to those who needed it. Looking back, I realized that the ice house was more than a stop on the errands of life. It was a reminder of ingenuity, of how people managed before technology made preservation simple. It carried with it the sense of awe that comes from touching something fleeting and precious. A cold that belonged to another time and yet found its way into kitchens across the town. There was a certain pride in the way local stores carried the town's name, hand-painted across windows or carved into wooden signs that hung above the doors. Each letter was brushed with care, often in bright colors that stood out against brick or clapboard, reminding everyone who passed that this was not a chain or an outsider's venture. It was a business built by neighbors for neighbors. I remember walking with Mama down Main Street and seeing those names repeated again and again, a constant reminder that our community sustained itself. Henderson's Grocery, Miller's Hardware, Johnson's Dry Goods, each name tied directly to a family we knew. When the owners stood behind the counter, their pride showed not only in the goods they sold but in the way they spoke about the town itself. A purchase there felt like more than a transaction. It was support for a family whose children went to school with yours, whose pew was just a few rows over on Sunday. Even the lettering on the windows seemed to carry a message. This store belongs to us, to this place, to our shared lives. On Saturdays, when the streets were busy, the storefronts created a kind of parade, each one gleaming with polish and care, their signs catching the light of the afternoon sun. Looking back, those names stitched the businesses to the fabric of the community in a way no generic brand ever could. They stood as proof that towns thrived on identity, on the pride of belonging, and on the unspoken promise that neighbors would look after one another, both inside and outside those doors. Clothing shops of that time carried their own special smell, a mix of wool, mothballs, and cedar that lingered in the air like a quiet signature. I remember stepping through the doorway and feeling the brush of heavy coats hanging on racks, their sleeves brushing against my arms as I passed. The coats were thick, lined with fur or quilted padding, made to last through bitter winters rather than follow passing styles. Dresses hung neatly on hangers, often protected in clear plastic, while hats and gloves filled small display tables near the front. The air always carried a faint tang of mothballs, sharp and unmistakable, a reminder that garments were carefully guarded through the seasons when they were stored away. Customers moved slowly, running their fingers over fabric, holding garments up to the light, weighing carefully whether they would stand the test of time. The clerk often knew each family well enough to suggest a size without needing to ask, sometimes stepping into the back to retrieve an item that had been set aside. Shopping there was rarely about indulgence. It was about practicality. Choosing clothes that could be worn for school, church, or work, patched and mended when needed, and handed down to younger siblings once they were outgrown. I can still picture Mama lifting a coat to my shoulders, checking the fit, then nodding with quiet satisfaction when it allowed room for another winter's growth. Looking back, those shops taught us that clothing carried more than thread. It carried planning, sacrifice, and care, stitched into every seam, making each garment more than just something to wear. Shops in those days did not keep late hours. Most closed by supper time, and on Sundays the doors stayed locked, the windows dark, and the streets unusually quiet. I remember walking through town after church, the sun warm on the pavement, every storefront resting as if it too had joined the Sabbath. It wasn't considered inconvenient. Families planned around it, making sure their errands were finished by Saturday evening, knowing nothing would open again until Monday morning. The hush of Sunday carried a kind of peace, with children playing in yards, neighbors sitting on porches, and the distant sound of hymns drifting from church windows, still lingering in the air. Even the town square felt different. Its benches empty, its clock tower marking time in stillness rather than bustle. Closing early was not about lost business. It was about balance, about giving store owners the same rest and time with family that customers cherished. For children, it meant one more day to spend together at home, sharing meals, visiting grandparents, or simply lazing in the grass. Looking back, those early closings were not a burden but a gift, a reminder that life had rhythms beyond commerce. It allowed people to breathe, to step away from work, and to remember that a town was not held together by its stores alone, but by the families who filled them the rest of the week. The arrival of the superstores was a turning point that carried both excitement and loss. At first, people marveled at the endless aisles, the bright lights, and the ability to buy everything in one place. Prices seemed lower, choices wider, and the convenience irresistible. Yet, with every cart filled under those vast ceilings, something familiar slipped quietly away. The grocer who once knew your family's name. The butcher who slipped children an extra slice. The clerk with a pencil behind his ear. Many of them closed their doors, unable to compete. The town square grew quieter, its windows dimmed, its benches less full of chatter. Shopping became faster, perhaps easier, but also lonelier. I remember Mama standing in one of those new stores, her list finished in half the time. Yet her face carried none of the joy she once found in visiting the smaller shops. We gained in variety, but we lost in connection, and that loss is felt even now. Looking back, I cannot deny the practicality of the superstores, but I also cannot forget the warmth of the world that came before. Life was measured not only in what we bought, but in who we saw, what we shared, and the trust that lived in every transaction. When the superstores arrived, they changed more than shopping. They changed the rhythm of community itself, leaving behind memories that live now only in stories like these.